Oh, Cindy, quiet. I don't think ever lived um, in Michigan. This one guy running for Senate. Yeah, about second. Yeah, to protect people because if Republicans can't get in to watch the votes being counted, that they need to use the guns. The Second Amendment wasn't for self-protection or for hunting. It's for things like this to be locked and loaded. And listen to this. Here's this other moron in Michigan. I don't know how Biden ever took Michigan, and he argued against survivors of sexual assault getting abortion. Said they didn't know if their unborn child could become president. And he said we said we thought putting that. He's got a friend who was the citing friend whose mother was a victim of a gang rape, claiming that people have become pregnant from sexual assault. Putting this woman by God, and the DNA of the fetus should be protected. And so we must start to focus not only on defending the DNA. Oh my God. So Cindy, are you there? Cindy.
Now the question is, can anybody hear me? That issue was with warm.
Do you have your speaker on?
I removed the mute. Let's put it that way.
I can hear you, Richard.
You can, thank you. Somebody responded, that's good.
Happy New Year, by the way.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Morning, Ruth.
Good morning, Rich.
James, I haven't seen you for a while. How have you been?
Me?
You're the only James logged in, actually.
Only James in the house? Wow.
There's only one James, I can assure you.
I'm doing well, thank you.
Uh,
We're submitting an offer today. I hope we get it. It's a very competitive market for this price of home.
What's the asking price, James?
1.197.
And what are you going to offer?
That's all we can offer. That's all they can afford.
Are you sure you want to waste your time?
No, hey, I can sense what I can do to advantage our offer a little bit. We're going to be very aggressive in our removal of contingency and closing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what they want, and they want a 30 days rent back. So
you gonna give that for free?
No.
James, do you want to know what the outcome of your offer is going to be right now? To tell you.
Hey.
Everybody that's walked into this conference room that's here today has said nothing but the same thing.
Yeah, I think we might be about 50,000 under, but that's all we can do. That's all they can.
Yeah, that's all I can do.
Yeah.
Right.
If not, we move on.
You got a good attitude, James. That's good.
Really. So Carlos,
Yes.
did you know that flat meat is on sale at Stater Brothers for $6.99 a pound?
I did not know
And
that.
today is the last day.
So I'm actually now going back to the old place, the Mexican butcher shop, because prices have come down.
Really?
Yep.
Well, last time I told you I did it for Thanksgiving instead of turkey because I had turkey up at Lorraine's. I did the flat meat and the wok. Excellent, just fabulous. Yeah, with a lot of fresh veggies. Rich, before we start, I had a question. I really like that Chris guy that talked about title.
Chris Aiken, yeah.
Yes,
Mhm.
but I had a question. Like he said, check and the new way to take title, the best way is community property with the right of survivorship.
Correct.
I changed that on my own house because I
You
think I
can't,
had,
well, is it in your trust or do you have a family trust?
yes.
It's probably presumed to be community property.
But how would
Because
I
right now
know?
it's already in the trust name.
So I'd look it up in the trust.
No, have you deeded the property to the trust in the name of the trust?
Yeah.
So if the vesting is in the trust, it's presumed to be community property.
Automatically?
Yeah.
But how would I?
That's my
I
understanding.
mean, how would I check?
Registered survivorship, right?
Well, there's nothing to check,
Oh, there's nothing to check?
right? It's in your trust, right? You check the vesting.
Yes.
I've asked that question because I wasn't quite sure myself. So that was a response that I received.
Okay.
So let's say you had it something different, right? Joint tenants, tenancy, whatever. you had it.
Yeah, that,
And then later on, you created the trust after you bought the property,
oh, yeah.
like,
What
Then
I'm being
it's
told is that
automatic.
because California is a community property state, it's presumed to be community property.
okay.
That's what I'm being told. Now, I don't have any case law to support that, but
But
if
you
I
know what
find
it
out,
means.
you don't get a step up in basis for one of those two people. That's what it means.
Well, it said you get a 100% step up.
Well, yes, for community property with right of survivorship as opposed to joint tenancy.
But there's no way to check and see if that's what the vesting is.
The vesting is going to be in the name of your trust.
Okay.
That's what you told me, right? If it's in the name of your trust and you and your husband are the beneficiary, you're the settlers or grantors of the trust, it's deemed to be.
Okay, I'm not gonna ask you.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? So I asked the question. That's what I was told. I had the same question. It was held as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Just because you deeded it to the trust, you get the benefit of the step up for both spouses. And I'm being told the answer is yes.
My husband died, I didn't get it all.
You've got bigger problems if your husband dies.
As long as the life insurance policy is mine.
Yeah.
That's somebody
Coming in,
sharing your
Mary?
screen, so your video's off. See the lines through?
Hey, you're welcome to come in if you want to. We're gonna get started.
You know, I have something for you.
You do it or not. Well, I don't care if you see me.
Yes, I got them.
I'm sorry, I'll put the video on. There. Now you should be able to see me. Well, good morning, everybody. How are you?
Morning.
I'm doing good. All right.
Everybody.
So some of this is going to be repetitive, but that's okay. Always questions come up. And so we're going to go through creating an RPA once again. So if you have the ability to create your own RPA as we go along, it's always suggested. So I'm going to click on new because I'm going to be writing an offer. I'm going to write an offer that's going to be accepted, James, because I'm going to offer 30% more than the asking price.
30% more. Are you crazy?
It's what it takes.
No, you're overpaying. You know the
Yes,
joke.
yes, that's exactly what's happening. If you want to buy a property, you're going to overpay and hope the market catches up. That's what it seems like is happening right now, because I don't think inventory has changed from last week, and last week, including coming soons, it was like 1,150 units or something like that total. So I'm getting a nod over here from someone else suggesting that the numbers really haven't changed. All right, so with that said, we're going to say new purchaser offer. And then I happen to choose a listing from our office, and that's going to be 230 Mayfair. Rich has to be able to type right though. And there it is, showing up in our search, shows up, right? It's a residential property. I'm going to click the button for residential. And then we're going to use MLS Connect. We do have some newer agents, so we're gonna run through this and click on MLS Connect. And it's preferred to have the MLS ID before you get to this point. So the ID number in my case is PW22015762. I'm going to include a property photo, makes it easy for me to identify when I pull up my desktop in Zip Form Plus. Click on Find, and what do you know? I got the right property. It worked this time. Didn't work last time, did it, Alex? Right? I don't know if it's because I used lowercase letters or not. I'm not sure. But then we're going to say use listing. So we're getting through. This is the easy part. The templates, there really are no templates for a purchase contract. All the forms that we need when writing an offer is already included. So we're going to say save. And now, guess what? Get rid of that. All right, so we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to add a few different forms. And this is what I would suggest in every single case. I would add a cover sheet. I would add the residential purchase agreement. And then just because I'm going to simplify my life, I want to go over this form briefly. The tenant occupied purchase agreement. Okay. And I just wanted to go over that form with you briefly because there are some good and bad things about that form. To simplify my life once again, I'm going to use the cover sheet. If I use a cover sheet, it's going to populate this information throughout the documents or forms that we add to the transaction. The buyer's name is Harriet.
Oh.
Nothing's new. And Harriet's email address happens to be richard.moore@cbplatinumproperties.com. So the only things you really need in the buyer information block is the name and the email address. You can put in other information if you so wish, but it's not required. Now the seller's name, I should have already looked up, which I didn't do, but I'm just going to say it's Carlos. So remember, when you pull up the MLS and look at the property, you can determine the name of the seller on the MLS, or you can use property profile if you care to get a more accurate description of the vesting itself. Sometimes the vesting in the MLS is not necessarily, it doesn't give clarity in regards to how the property is properly vested. So I personally prefer using property profile myself to verify that information. And even then, when looking at property profile, what I suggest doing is looking at the most recent grant deed. And that way, when you look at the grant deed, you can actually then determine the correct vesting of that property. Okay. So I've got the seller's name in there, and you can see now under property information, because I use MLS Connect, it pulled all of the information and all the hard work that the listing agent put into that listing. Zip code, assessor ID, so on and so forth, the list price. Now, if we want, we can actually put in a purchase price in here, or we can go to the RPA itself and populate the purchase price for the RPA. In this case, I'm just going to put a purchase price in here at this point in time. And then the purchase agreement date. Remember, it's simply just a reference date. It is going to be a date that you would refer to in any single case in which you issue a counteroffer, an addendum, or any other document that modifies the existing document. It is not the date of acceptance when you're using this reference date. Keep that in mind. All right, and I'll show you that on the purchase contract just so you're clear about that. Now, in our case, we can say the deposit amount, let's just say we're going to put 3% down, so $30,000. And it's just easy to do it in the cover sheet, in my opinion. That's why I'm doing it here. And then we can just move on, as a matter of fact. See how simple that is? And then keep in mind, under buyer's broker information, we're pulling in the name of the offices that listed the property. So remember, in this case, buyer's broker information is going to be Richard Moore. I'm going to pull in my license information for both the office and me individually. And then you can see the seller's broker's information is already populated. The listing office DRE license number is our office license number. And in this case, Joyce Lynn's DRE license number is already populated for us because that's information she put into the listing already. So we've just simplified our life dramatically. Now we really don't have to do anything else in this case. So we're going to click on save. Any questions about that before we move on? Seems relatively simple. Actually, the new RPA, I think, is easy to use. It's just understanding the underlying information behind it. That's really what I think is critical in regards to anything that you do. So I'm going to pull up the residential purchase agreement. And remember, the agency disclosure is the very first form. Do not check this box unless it's for a lease in excess of 1 year. And then what I suggest, check the box. Harriet is our buyer, so I would check the box for buyer, so it's explicit in regards to what Harriet's role is in the transaction. You can see it's already populated the company name, the agent's name, and license information. And then under confirmation, this is just an example only. This does not require anybody to complete this information, but we'll see this exact block shown on page 1 of the residential purchase agreement. And we must complete this in its entirety. If we don't, confirmation of agency is not complete. And thereafter, you must complete a form CA, confirmation of agency, if these blocks are not complete in their entirety. Fair housing and discrimination advisory, that's all it is, just an advisory. And I suggest you read it. It really is good information for anybody because you can actually discriminate without any intent of discriminating. So it's very important that you read the information here to understand just how far-reaching discrimination is.
Unless you have intent to discriminate.
No, you don't need any intent. No intent necessary. Yeah, that'll make it easy. I didn't intend to discriminate against you. And then the next form, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Yeah, John Barris and I had a discussion this morning because he may very well be double ending his listing that he just took recently. He had 100 people show up at the open house on Saturday. It's a lot of people in Westminster. Yeah, a lot of people. So what we're putting everybody on notice is very simple. I could be representing multiple buyers for the same property. I could be representing you, Mr. Seller, and I could be representing your neighbor next door, for example, in regards to listing their property, or I could be representing both buyer and seller. So this is a disclosure required by statute. Wire fraud and electronic funds advisory. Don't send money without calling escrow first. That's what I would suggest. Any questions? Yeah, pretty simple so far, right? Not much to do there. So the date prepared, remember in the cover sheet, I mentioned that this is simply just a reference date. And this date, once again, is going to be used the reference date for any time we issue a counteroffer, an addendum, or any other form that in any way amends the purchase contract or is attributed to the purchase contract itself. So now you can see it's an offer from Harriet because I filled in a cover sheet. So it's just filling that information in for me, the address, the APN number, and then confirmation of agency. This is something we talked about in page 2 of the agency disclosure form. And you can see it's filled in the name of the offices for us and the license information. And this is critical. Remember, if the transaction is under the same broker's license number, in this case, 01516164, and both seller or listing agent and agent representing the buyer are involved in the transaction, it's deemed to be dual agency. So we're going to check the box, both buyer and seller. And you can see the system's smart, so it checks the remaining boxes for us accordingly. If for some reason the offices were different, we would say that Joyce Lynn, who we know is listing agent, is representing the seller, and Richard Moore is representing the buyer. So that would be the manner in which we would complete confirmation of agency. And keep in mind, confirmation of agency is only complete when the agents sign the signature pages of the RPA. So yes, even though you're not a party to the transaction, you have an obligation statutorily to complete the confirmation of agency. If you don't do it here properly, you must do so at some later time. So I'm just going to correct this at this point in time, so we know. Right. So now we've completed that. And please, so often in purchase contracts, I don't see that information complete. As a matter of fact, we just received a complaint from the Department of Real Estate on a transaction that closed in May because the buyer is stating that the agent did not properly disclose that there were parking limitations associated with this property. When I looked at page 1 of the RPA, guess what? Boxes aren't checked. That's the last thing I want to show the Department of Real Estate when I'm responding to their to their complaint, right? We did a perfect job. It was interesting.
Rich, I have a question because
what's that, John?
Rich, I have a question because one of the offers I received did not have the boxes filled in for me. They had it for them. I put that on the counter that it needed to be corrected to include Coldwell Banker and me. Does that cover us?
It may. I think the best thing to do, John, when you issue the counter, is to issue the counter and attach a confirmation of agency, which is a separate form. Once again, yeah, more work, unfortunately, but it would be the appropriate because it's going to match the required language that we saw on page 2 of the agency disclosure. So I think that would be the most appropriate method in which to do it. And not only that, John, but if you edit that on the counter offer, neither you nor the agent submitting the offer are signing that form. So is it complete without signatures on that form? Good question. I wouldn't leave it to chance. So attach form CA to the counter offer.
Richard, you're talking about those boxes where the cursor's blinking, or which boxes?
Right here. Can you see where my cursor is?
Those boxes were missing.
They were not checked.
They weren't.
They were not checked, correct. So just because it is very common, unfortunately, it's I don't know why it's overlooked, but it is.
It's more common with other brokerages when we get the purchase agreement from them. Not as much our agents, but.
Oh, Carlos reviews everything, so he would know. Well, that's great. So we're doing a great job here. I'm very happy about that. Any other questions before we move on? No, okay. So section 3A, we decided our purchase price was going to be $1 million. If we check all cash, it's going to remove the ability to address the financing. And remember, if you check the box for all cash, if you look farther down in the form, it indicates that it is not contingent upon getting a loan. All cash is deemed to be a form of financing in terms of how it's defined in the purchase contract. When you get a loan, all cash, it all falls under the form of financing, as a matter of fact. So in our case, it is not going to be an all cash offer.
We have a question for section C under the agency.
Okay. It's in their chat.
Yeah. What about item C?
What about item C? All right, good question. I skipped over that and I shouldn't have. So in the event there are two different brokerages, two different licensed brokerages representing a client, then we would check that box. For example, there could be two different offices representing the buyer. And if that were the case, we would attach form ABA, which is additional broker acknowledgement. And that form tells the readers and tells everyone that signs it that anyone signing on behalf of either brokerage is signing on behalf of all brokers representing the buyer in this example. Likewise, if it's a seller, same thing. The additional broker acknowledgement form would be used. There's more than one office who is listing the property. Okay. Hopefully that answers the question. Another one.
If you offer all cash, do you obtain the loan, or do you have to disclose that?
It is not a requirement that, so once again, question, if you offer all cash, can you obtain financing? You're permitted to contractually. However, if you can't close within the manner in which you specify in the contract, it would be a breach. So you cannot use a loan contingency. But yes, we see that happen quite often. People believe, and it's true, I would say, when an all cash offer is presented. I think the seller looks at that and believes, oh, this is a stronger offer. Now, do they really have the money, or do they intend to pay all cash? That's a good question. So in making that determination when you're representing the seller, look at the evidence of funds, the bank statements, be sure that whomever is making the offer, whatever name that is, the name on the bank statements, for example, should be the same. If there's a married couple on the offer, but there's 3 or 4 names on the bank statement, I would be concerned about them actually having access to that account. It may not be their money. They may not have control over that. If it's an LLC, for example, well, the question could be, when did they deposit that money? Just yesterday or in the last month? So are they making multiple offers also? If it's an investor, they have $1 million, showing on their bank statements, could they be making offers on 10 different properties? Now we may never have the answer to that, but it's something to give consideration to when you are evaluating offers. And then,
So can I,
sure, go ahead.
Another thing would be, if you switch it from all cash to financing, you can no longer cancel for the loan contingency or the appraisal contingency, right?
If you switch from all cash to financing, right? The appraisal contingency, that's not true. You'd have to waive the appraisal contingency itself, but you can't cancel based upon the inability to obtain financing. So it is not a breach of contract if you specify my offer consists of all cash and yet you pursue financing. Seller has no obligation to cooperate in regards to you obtaining financing. But I don't think the seller wants to be in a position of causing the transaction to fail. So that's another thing I would give thought to. Demi wants to know, how long in advance do you suggest money is in an account? Well, a lender expects the money to be seasoned for 2 full calendar months. So you can look at it that way because it's been in the account for a sufficient amount of time, well before the offer's been made. And that's up to the seller in terms of what they believe or deem to be acceptable evidence of the cash. So they could say, no, I want to see 2 bank statements for 2 full months. That's up to the seller to make that decision. Would the lender have any trouble with finance if the offer is written all cash? I would say no. I don't think there's any kind of an issue there. And the only reason I'm saying that, we see it happen quite often, where it's an all cash offer and the buyer's pursuing financing. Typically, in that situation, when somebody's making an all cash offer, they're already speaking to a lender well in advance also. So I don't think the lender, at least I have never come across a situation in which the lender says you need to change the terms of the contract to reflect that you're obtaining financing as opposed to paying all cash. All right, section 3B, close of escrow. Yeah, we could say 30 days after acceptance. Or we can specify a date. I don't recommend specifying a date, not knowing when acceptance will occur. And keep in mind, the other thing, when it says 30 days after acceptance, escrow is not going, the parties have agreed to close 30 days after acceptance, not sooner, not later. So if the parties were to agree to close sooner, it's going to require a written amendment or instructions to tell escrow to close sooner. If you were to say 30 days or sooner, escrow would probably just accept an email and allow the transaction to close sooner. So keep that in mind. Expiration of offer, section 3C. The default is 3 days after the date of the last signature of all buyer signatures. So 3 days, 3 calendar days, just count them. So if that offer is signed yesterday and submitted today, there are only 2 remaining days for that offer before it expires. And the question is, where would you write or sooner? I would probably do that under other financing terms, because the contract unfortunately does not simplify our ability to do something like that. So the question was in regards to the close of escrow, where would we write 30 days or sooner? Probably down farther. I'll show you, let's see, you could say under other terms, for example, you could write it there. Or if you want to add clarity, you can always attach an addendum also. But unfortunately, with the revision, it should have allowed something like that. It would have just simplified it because we see that so often. Okay. Maybe that'll make it easier to see. Almost there, sorry. The initial deposit, we completed that information on within the cover sheets, and the percentage is just something that the system populates. Okay. And if you look to the right of section D1, it says the deposit, the initial deposit is to be made within 3 business days after acceptance. So business days, if we have acceptance on Friday, the buyer has until Wednesday to make their deposit based upon the default language in the contract. If I'm a listing agent, I'm going to, most likely, you're probably going to issue a counter anyways. I'm going to counter that and I'm going to say 1 business day. And keep in mind, if in the event the buyer does not deposit the money within the specified time frame, the seller can cancel, but only after issuing a notice to perform. And the default time frame for the buyer to comply is 2 days following delivery of the notice to perform. So you can see how much time can it pass if you're not on top of that as a listing agent. And the contract does specifically state wire transfer. Now, many escrows will accept, they won't accept ACH transfers. It is not, they're not considered to be good funds in the state of California. It's like writing a personal check, and an ACH transfer can be rescinded within 7 days following remittance. And then if it is a cashier's check, most escrows will accept it. However, for closing funds, we're not going to accept a cashier's check. There's too much fraud, and most banks now are putting a 7 to 10 day hold even on cashier's checks. So if your client says, I can't issue a wire, too bad. If they want to close, unless they're willing to spend 7 to 10 more days and have assurance that that check is cleared, then it's going to postpone or delay the transaction. I'm sorry. Okay. If you offer cash and say close of escrows will be 30 days or sooner, do you have to close sooner than 30 days? No. It's only if both parties consent to that. Increased deposit, it's kind of rare. We see that more in commercial transactions. If there's an event that occurs, sometimes the buyer is required then to deposit additional monies. And if you're going to in any way increase the actual deposit to make it subject to liquidated damages, you'd have to include Form DID. And that would make the additional monies not to exceed 3% of the purchase price, subject to the liquidated damages clause. And the liquidated damages clause, in terms of the limitation of 3% of the purchase price, is applicable to an owner-occupied property. If it's an investment property, the 3% limitation does not apply. All right, then the loan amount. So we're going to put a total of 20% down. So I'm going to put $800,000 down. Remember, insert a cap for the interest rate. The default type of financing that's presumed is conventional financing. And then we want to state a cap for the interest rate. We know that interest rates are inclining right now. Make sure that you give yourself room for flexibility, because if you rates today are 3 3/8 or 3 1/2, if you were to put 3 3/8 in there, most likely the listing agent is going to counter that out. I would certainly. All right, and then the default in terms of points, it is 0 points. So that's something that was a big change from the prior contract. So they don't have to pay any points to get that interest rate. And if in the event rates today exceed 4%, it is a valid contingency for the buyer to cancel the transaction. And then to the right, we can see conventional financing is presumed. You can, if your buyer's getting FHA or VA financing, you would choose that, obviously. And when choosing FHA or VA financing, then Form FVAC must be attached, and that is the FHA VA amendatory clause. Now, what's bad about that, the amendatory clause is going to state what the purchase price or what the appraised value must be. So the appraised value can't come in any less than the purchase price. So in the event the appraised value is less than the purchase price, the buyer, even if releasing the loan contingency, or the appraisal contingency rather, still can cancel the transaction, and the seller has no rights in terms of recovery of the liquidated damages clause. In addition to that, the other dilemma with that is if the buyer is getting an FHA or VA loan and the appraised value comes in less than the purchase price, they can take this thing all the way up to the close of escrow, and the seller cannot cancel. So the buyer could take it, control that property, cancel the day of the close of escrow, simply because the FHA VA amendatory clause was not met, meaning it did not equal or exceed the purchase price itself. So it's something to give consideration to when you're entertaining offers. We don't see many FHA or VA offers around here. And then also you can, under section E1, if FHA or VA is checked, there could be repairs that are required by the lender. And if the seller refuses to do those repairs, the transaction is going to fail. So the buyer has an obligation to deliver that request for repairs from the lender within 17 days. And remember, just because it says that, it just lives on unless you send a notice of reform to bring that time frame to a close. Section E2, additional finance amount. It could be secondary financing, so that's kind of rare. We've seen things like that. And then occupancy type, primary is the default. So remember, when you're reading offers and you're receiving them, or if you're submitting, if it's not a primary residence, be sure that you're aware of that. If it's secondary or investment, the pre-approval letter assuming the buyer is obtaining financing should indicate that it's for an investment property. So you can see the system magically tells us that we have to come in with $170,000 and the purchase price is $1 million because we said also we're bringing $30,000 in. Section G1, any questions? There's something in the chat, I missed that. So Julia, let's see. So what do agents use for expiration of offer? Because as far as I'm concerned, it is usually a mere suggestion. Do people usually hold a seller to it? And do you have to do a new RPA if the offer expires? Good question. And you're right. Typically what's taking place now is sellers are taking their time in regards to responding to offers. And so theoretically the offers do expire. Now, when the seller responds via a counteroffer, that counteroffer is technically deemed to be a new offer. What I suggest if I'm the listing agent, I would amend, or actually in my counteroffer, I would state that the expiration of the original offer is extended to a future date. And that way, when all parties sign it, everybody's agreeing now that the expiration date has been extended. So there's no question about what's taking place. It can be a question otherwise, but the actions of the parties will ratify the terms of the contract. So if you don't include that language in a counteroffer and the original offer has expired, let's assume the seller responds and then they deliver the purchase contract to escrow, and then the buyer delivers their deposit to escrow, that's ratifying the contract. But why even leave it to chance, right? It's never a problem until there's an issue. So when an issue comes up, everybody starts looking for every possible mistake that occurs in a contract.
This is another question.
Yeah, I see it. So if you offer 20% down and want to do only 10% down, is there a problem or for you or your lender? Yes. Typically, there's no problem for the lender, but it is a problem for the buyer. So if I state I'm putting 20% down and I pursue a loan for 10% down, and I don't qualify, it is not a valid reason for cancellation based upon the loan contingency. So be sure that your buyer is aware of that. Whatever they stipulate in the purchase contract, they said they're gonna, whatever the down payment is, that's the financing. That is, should they not, if they pursue financing other than what's stipulated in the contract, well, that's a problem. And loan contingency may not save them, and they could be in breach of contract. Okay, we got all the questions there. Section G1, seller credit, if any, to buyer. Kind of rare right now, but if there is a credit, remember, no matter what, whether it's negotiated at the inception of the contract or later on, be sure that the lender is made aware of it as soon as possible. And then also the contract itself talks about credits. And if, let's assume it's a $10,000 credit, maybe it's negotiated because of repairs or in lieu of repairs. Then in the event the lender does not permit the entire credit to be used because based on limitations, that credit can be lost. So you must specify if you negotiate a credit that any unused credit will result in a dollar for dollar direct reduction in the purchase price. Additional financing terms. The question came up in regards to about 30 days or sooner. You could use this area, for example, to type that in. And then H1, verification of all cash. That would be simply if in the event an all cash offer, well, the default is that the evidence is attached to the purchase contract. I wouldn't accept a contract with which the information is not attached. Once a contract's executed, cancellation is always an issue. We don't want to get into that. So if you're a listing agent or representing the buyer, be sure you have all that information submitted with the offer. Why would anyone even give consideration to your offer if you can't prove that you have it? And then in addition to that, it's not a contingency of the contract, whether it's verification of down payment and closing costs or verification of all cash. Neither is the contingency of the contract. So if you can't come up with the money to buy the $1 million home, or you don't have the funds for the 20% down payment, it is a contractual covenant that you must do so. So if you don't have the money, it's not a contingency and it's not a reason for cancellation of good faith. So you as the buyer can lose your money. verification of loan applications. So the default is that there's a pre-approval attached. Let me see, there's a question here. So if the selling agent is crediting their buyers at the close of escrow, it doesn't have to be disclosed here in the contract, does it? It does not. That's correct, Jeff. And it would have nothing to do with, this would be in the event the other party is issuing a credit. So no, there's no reason to disclose that in here. And then verification of loan application. So the default is that it's attached, and then we have choices to the right, pre-qualification or pre-approval. So fully underwritten pre-approval is preferred. We don't see that often. We see more pre-approvals. So remember, when you're looking at the pre-approval, I've come across pre-approval letters that state that the borrower has not provided any documentation yet. So I don't consider that to be a pre-approval. It's just based upon the buyer's representation of their income and expenses. So it's not as strong. So the letter should tell you whether or not the buyer has submitted documentation to provide evidence of their income, for example, expenses. So there's a big difference in my opinion. I want to know that they have submitted documentation for that pre-approval. Final verification of condition, 5 days before is the default. And remember, the final verification of condition is just to verify that the property is in the condition in which the buyer originally found it. And it's really a warranty and that's in favor of the buyer. Because if the stove was working at the time the buyer did their inspection, for example, or when they saw it, it's not working at the final verification of property condition, seller has an obligation to correct that. But if it was never working and the buyer never requested it to be repaired, then it would not be. So we're not there to look for utter deficiencies in the property. We're there to verify properties in the same condition, and should the seller have agreed to complete any repairs, that those repairs are indeed complete. And the questions always come up, well, what if they don't do all the repairs? Well, what if the repair is $500 or $1,000? Can the buyer simply state, I'm not going to close escrow? I would say no. I would say that, yeah, it may be a breach, but it's not a material breach in regards to the transaction itself. Because what's $1,000 in relation to $1 million purchase contract? If it's a $20,000 repair, that's probably a valid reason for the buyer to not close a transaction and not deemed to be in breach of the contract. So everything is taking the context in terms of materiality. Assignment requests. The contract now is addressing that, and we see a lot of contracts in many cases in which maybe it's an LLC or an individual, and they'll assign their interest in the contract to another buyer, for example. Or we see sometimes 2, 3, or 4 buyers on the contract, and then the assignment is from those individuals to maybe one of those buyers, or it could be from 2 buyers to 3 buyers. Now, the seller cannot unreasonably withhold assignment of the contract. However, there are certain things in which they can. So let's assume, first of all, that it's Richard Moore and I'm assigning my interest to the Richard Moore Family Revocable Trust. Can the seller withhold the assignment or withhold their ability to prevent me from signing it? Probably not, because the ownership interest is the same. But if I'm assigning my interest to Carlos, now that's a different story. And that would be, if I'm the seller, I would say, Carlos, you're buying the house for $1 million. You said you're putting 20% down. I want to see evidence that you had the 20% and that you qualify before I grant the assignment. So far different. And then in terms of the assignment, the forms that CAR is prepared for us to use, the assignment does not allow the buyer, or the buyer still has the same obligations as they did even before the assignment. So if there's a breach, transaction doesn't close, then not only is the original buyer, the assignor, on the hook, but the assignee is also on the hook also in regards to any recourse that the seller may have against those parties. Any questions about that? So now they're saying 17 days for the assignment. I don't know if the time frame really is relevant, but we certainly want to know early on if there's an assignment. And then contingencies. So now this is Everybody wants to know, what should I be doing when I am submitting an offer? Now, the default time frame for the loan contingency is 17 days. I certainly suggest reducing that. Make sure that if you're working with a lender, that they are giving you appropriate information to see what you can do about reducing that loan contingency. So let's assume your lender says, I need the full 17 days and it's a competitive environment. I would probably say 10 or 14 days anyways. I'm going to ask for forgiveness and I'm going to force the listing agent to send me a notice to perform before I remove my loan contingency. Because remember, the contingency lives on. So and it's not deemed to be a breach of contract. So even if you're pushing it, do what you have to do. Once you've had that property tied up, the seller is always in an awkward position when there's an executed contract. And the only way they can cancel is by delivering a notice to perform before they do that. And then if you want to submit no loan contingency, you could do that. Appraisal. It is subject to an appraisal contingency. Many people are removing the appraisal contingency. In my opinion, it's almost meaningless. Now, in the event you do check the box, no appraisal contingency, and of course, here's what buyers say, I'm willing to pay more than the appraised value. Well, they're liars. That's what we typically witness all the time. Suddenly they get cold feet and they don't want to do that. Never, ever disclose the appraisal to the other party. I don't care if it comes in more, less, or at the purchase price. You've got no obligation to share that information. However, the contract does stipulate that if you cancel based upon the appraisal, because the appraisal came in less than the purchase price, they're entitled to a copy of the appraisal. So be careful about your reasons for cancellation. We'll find a different reason to cancel a contract other than mentioning appraisal contingency. Now, in the contract, it talks about all reports that the buyer obtains or investigations, they're required to give copies of those reports to the seller. Well, the appraisal is deemed to be an opinion of value, so it's not a report. And that's why it doesn't fall under the same guidelines. And remember, your obligation when representing a buyer to provide a copy of the inspection report, for example, lives beyond the life of the contract. So even if the contract fails, you have an obligation to provide that documentation. However, if I'm the agent representing the seller, I'm not going to push you for it, because if I find deficiencies in that report, guess what? I've got to disclose that. So don't push it if they don't give it to you. Yes, we want to know, we want to keep their money. But the other side is they're not going to close escrow anyways. And it's easy to find valid reasons to cancel a contract based upon the investigation contingency. Any no questions? All right. Informational access to property. That's simply a time frame in which the buyer has access to complete their investigations. And we have had investigations that have gone on beyond the time frame, and we've simply said to the buyer, no more. You cannot access the property because it was never ending. All right, so you don't have to give them access to the property beyond the time frame. Review of seller documents. That's the time for the buyer to review all the seller disclosures in the default 17 days. Reduce that. Reduce all of these in this environment now. So you still have control over the property, and I think that's probably the most important thing. So I would reduce that. Remember, review the seller documents. In the body of the contract, it talks about the seller's obligation to deliver their disclosures. For example, that the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire. So the seller has 7 days to deliver all the seller disclosures. If they deliver on day 8, the contingency period is equal to the date of delivery plus 5 days. If they deliver on day 7 or before, the contingency time frame that you see in the schedule right here is what is going to be applicable. So there are agents that aren't on top of it in terms of delivering their disclosures. Preliminary title report, once again, make that aggressive, make that 10 days, make it 7 days. But review it. Don't just take it for granted. Look at the title report. Mary Guac is here. She's happy to conduct a class in regards to reading a prelim. Any exceptions in that report are always critical. Don't ever take anything for granted in terms of exceptions on the report. I'll give you a couple of examples of exceptions. Recently, where we're having issues in one specific case. It's a property in Laguna Beach. And Alex, this is repetitive for you. But on the preliminary title report, one of the exceptions refers to a conditional use permit, and that conditional use permit limits who can occupy the property, not buy the property, but it's limited to an artist work live environment. So if you're not an artist and you can't obtain a permit from the city of Laguna Beach, you cannot occupy the property. In addition to that, City of Laguna Beach has a real property report, and it talks about the conditional use permit. But if you don't drill down on those things, you're not going to know. You need to read them. That would be my suggestion. And if you're not sure how to interpret it, send that to your client. Say, hey, this could be an issue. You need to have your attorney review this and be sure that it's acceptable to you. Irvine, it's not in it. Irvine has very vanilla products, so it seems. Not in all cases, but a couple of other things. Parking. So that's another issue we have right now, because the CC&Rs restrict parking, and the buyer's claiming that they were not made aware that there are parking restrictions. I don't know where our obligation ends. It seems like it never does end, as a matter of fact. Common interest disclosures, lengthy in terms of us interpreting and reading everything. That's a good question. That's always going to be cited case by case, but required by Civil Code 4525, that basically is referencing the seller's obligation to provide the buyer the common interest disclosures. Also, Civil Code 4525 assigns responsibility in terms of payment. And for most of the disclosures required under Civil Code 4525, most of the cost is borne by the seller. So we'll have transactions at which the buyer and seller want to waive the common interest disclosures. Don't just tell them no. It's a violation of the Civil Code. They cannot waive receipt of those documents. And if they're going to do that, then we're going to put it in writing and we're going to have them sign something. They're acting against our advice, and it's a violation. So we don't want to do that. Review of leased or lien items, for example, solar panels, it is a contingency of the contract. And then to the right, removal or waiver of contingency, you can submit offers and attach a contingency removal form, removing certain contingencies, or you can remove all. And remember the game, you can submit that contingency removal form, removing all contingencies. However, the only real way to do that for all contingencies to be removed is to have the seller deliver all seller disclosures before the offer is submitted. So once the seller provides the TDS, it opens up the rescission period for the buyer. So a seller's a listing agent is going to say, oh, I got an offer, all contingencies are removed. Well, once the seller delivers the seller disclosures of the TDS and the SBQ, it opens up a rescission period. And assuming there's a valid reason for cancellation, the buyer can cancel. So it can be, I think, misinterpreted. So be very careful about that when you're talking to your seller about the offers. And likewise, it's a strategy when representing a buyer. Hey, yeah, we can submit this offer removing all contingencies. We don't have the seller disclosures, so we still have an opportunity to cancel if there's a good faith reason based upon those seller disclosures. They give us a TDS or something in there we don't like, seller property questionnaire. It opens up the rescission period. So keep that in mind. It's another approach, possibly.
So one more time, you left the contingency for inspection. You haven't delivered the SSPQ. They deliver it 3 days later. You have a rescission, right? Another 3 days? 5 days?
3 days, right. 3 days if delivered personally, 5 if delivered by mail or electronically, right? Yes. So James, you want to get aggressive with your offer? Maybe that's a consideration. A little riskier. Don't do that if it's a probate sale, for example, or it's a sale in which it's a property's in a trust and the grantor of the trust, someone who established the trust, is deceased and the successor trustee, for example, is selling the property. and they didn't occupy the property in the last year. Because remember, in those cases, they're exempt from TDS law. They don't have to provide a TDS or seller property questionnaire. They may have to provide an ESQ or ESD, exempt seller disclosure, but there's only a few items on there that probably would be a valid reason for cancellation: death, ordinance, insurance claims. But it limits the reasons for termination if you're in that kind of a position. And then, any questions about that? Right? Almost missed it. L8, sale of buyer's property. So if the buyer's offer is contingent upon the sale of their property, they should attach Form COP. And that form can be completed in a number of manners. So you have to read that carefully as a listing agent. You're going to accept a contingent offer. And one of the selections could be that contingency lasts through the close of escrow of the replacement property. So it gives the buyer a way out. And one time of possession, as soon as it records, that's the default. You can specify any other forms of possession. Now, the TOPA, I wanted to go to that. Just wanted to show you that. So now the RPA is suggesting, and you don't have to do this, that a tenant occupied property addendum is attached, assuming the property is occupied by a tenant. So here's what I don't, so this form will say you take it subject to the tenant's possession, right? If there's an existing lease, the tenant still has the same rights that they had under the former owner. However, if we say section 1B, property to be delivered vacant, the way the form is reading, this form is reading, if in the event the seller is not successful in vacating the property, the buyer's recourse is limited. They can recover their costs, things like that, but that's it. So I probably, if I'm buying a property that's tenant occupied, and my contract says the tenant is to be out of the property 5 days prior to the close of escrow, I may not use this form because, hey, if they default, I want to have the authority to pursue this sale, whether it's through specific performance or whatever I think I need to do. Whereas in this case, we're giving up virtually almost all of our remedies, excluding recovering our costs, appraisal, things like that. So it's something to give consideration to. So I wanted to bring that up also. So you don't have to attach this form. Make sure I'm not missing anything in here. And actually, what I would suggest doing in the event you're going to write an offer for a property that's tenant occupied, I would use the RIPA, because it's going to address things, for example, like estoppel certificates, whereas the RPA does not. It's also going to address prorations. No questions about that? Okay. Let's see, section N2, sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. So you can see returning the escrow instructions, it's a contractual covenant. So if one party doesn't do it, what's your recourse? To deliver a notice of reform, and if they don't return them, you can cancel the transaction. That's about it. And then N3, this is helpful, time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. It really is putting the seller on notice. Hey, you need to order the common interest disclosures within the first 3 days following acceptance. And then let's see, N4, install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. So this is saying that the seller has 7 days after acceptance to install those items, so it's in compliance. And when reading the body of the contract, why is that important? Well, now, if let's assume the buyer's getting a loan and there's an appraisal and the appraiser goes out and calls out deficiencies because the smoke detectors aren't installed. If they're not, and there's a reinspection required, the buyer can recover the cost of the reinspection from the seller, whereas the former contract did not give that ability to the buyer. So the seller should do all of these things before those inspections or the appraisal takes place, right? Especially because an appraiser will require that to be in compliance. And then evidence of representative authority. This kind of goes back to last week's meeting, also when Chris Akins conducted the meeting. So the contract, it says within 3 days of acceptance. Let's go back, say if it's an LLC. How do we really know the person who's signing on behalf of the LLC has authority to act on behalf of that entity? Well, they need to give us information. They need to give us the operating agreement, for example. If it's a trust, a family trust, then a trust certification may be sufficient evidence, or a copy of the trust itself. For an LLC, it could be one person signing, but maybe there's 2 individuals that are required to act on behalf of the LLC. So you don't know, and that's why it's important also that that's delivered. And likewise, when you're submitting an offer and it's not an individual, well, the seller has an obligation to comply with the same obligation to give evidence that they have authority to sell the property. So there's a question. Are there still laws in effect regarding getting tenants out because of COVID? If you've got the tenant then and the required notice, can they still refuse to leave? No, there is no benefit now for a tenant because of COVID. So the only benefit a tenant has, first of all, they have an obligation to allow you access to the property. You, upon giving them written notice, you can access the property within 24 hours. And then if you use the form notice of sale and entry, assuming the property is listed, upon delivery of that, you only need to give them 24-hour telephonic notice, but if they refuse access, you can't enter the property, as unfair as that may be. Yeah. Tenants have a lot of rights. And then section P, items included and excluded. Some of this is redundant because all of the fixtures associated with the property are mentioned further in the body of the contract, but whenever in doubt, check the boxes. Specify those things that you think may be questionable, even if they're not questionable, check it anyways. That's my thought. The natural hazard disclosure, Q1, it's just a report. Remember, typically the seller customarily pays, and check the box for environmental. Now, if someone is exempt from providing a transfer disclosure statement or transfer disclosure law, they don't have to provide an NHD, but there are certain disclosures within the NHC, for example, earthquake zones, I think, flooding and or fire, that I can only find in an NHD, so it's worth it for $100 to do that. So that I would recommend that to anybody in terms of to meet their disclosure requirements. And then Q2 and Q3, sometimes I see physical inspection. Now, I would never type that in. Of course, first of all, I can't type properly. As you can see, spell check is not part of the system. If I'm representing the buyer and the buyer is going to be paying for the physical inspection, there's no reason to put that in here. If you think you can get the other party to pay for it, then you should put it in. So if it's a report that you yourself, you're representing a buyer and the buyer intends to pay for it, you don't have to specify it. However, in this area, this is an area which you might want to specify pest control. Pest control, right? And commonly the seller pays for a pest control report. And then Q4, smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors. The seller's obligation, assuming they're not exempt, is to be sure that the property is in compliance and provide a certification. But the law itself does not specify which party is obligated to pay for it. But commonly, the seller is going to pay for that. Government required point of sale inspections and reports. Very few areas have anything. Well, Los Angeles does. We won't get into that today. City of Newport Beach has an inspection that has to be completed. You can just pay a fee and have the inspection waived. City of Laguna Beach, you must obtain a real property report, and that's almost $600. So that is a requirement for every sale of property in the City of Laguna Beach. So you can assign responsibility for payment of those reports. Typically in the City of Laguna Beach, for the real property report, the seller commonly pays. Now, government required point of sale corrective remedial actions. For most areas, for example, Irvine, this is referring to water conservation and plumbing fixtures. So if I'm in today's world, I would never specify that the seller is going to be paying for that. They're going to counter out anyways. Make your offer as simple as possible. You can just say, leave it blank or say buyer. Because in the event, let's assume it's a property from 1955 and none of the faucets or toilets have been replaced. You can be assured that they don't comply with water conservation and plumbing fixture requirements. And if we say the seller is to pay, the seller is going to have to replace all the toilets and faucets. So if you're the listing agent, be very careful of that. That it is not a point of sale requirement in Orange County. It is in San Diego County, and most properties, it depends upon the municipality in the county of Los Angeles. Certain cities require that homes meet the water conservation and plumbing fixture requirements. Not all do. Whittier, for example, it's in LA County. It does not have that requirement. So you'd have to look that up to be sure that you know what you're doing. Escrow fees commonly, I would suggest each pay their own. That would be my approach. Owner's title insurance policy, commonly the seller pays for it. Remember, to the right, you can specify escrow holder, and you can also specify the title company, and I suggest doing that. Once again, if you know you're going to be competing, I probably would say seller's choice. Make it as easy as possible. The buyer's lender title policy, you can see the default is the buyer pays. County transfer tax and fees, commonly the seller pays, that's $1.10 per thousand. In certain areas of the city of Los Angeles, it's $4.50 per thousand. Expensive. So city transfer tax and fees, it's rare we see that. If you're ever unsure, you can check the box, and just to show that you're more intelligent, you could type in if applicable. So if you're unsure, and you want to cover yourself, say seller in if applicable. Right? HOA fee for preparing disclosures, that falls under Civil Code 4525. You can see the seller must pay. HOA certification fee, typically it's the buyer's lender that requests that. That's why the default is the buyer pays. Transfer fees, typically the seller pays, doesn't have to be. Private transfer fees, you can see the default is seller. I think in Orange County, the only area where it has private transfer fees is Ladera Ranch. And it's 25 basis points of the selling price, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah. Then if there's anything else, if you want to, home warranty plan, typically the seller pays, and you can actually put a cost not to exceed, right? Other terms. Any questions? And then property type. Let's just, a couple of these things, I just want to go through it, but if it is a probate, if it's the property is in probate, you would still be using the same RPA, but you would be attaching the probate purchase agreement addendum, right? Should things in there that it addresses. And then if you want to include the tenant occupied property addendum, keep in mind, I think it would be dependent upon each and every situation. We don't really see too many tenancy in common purchase addendums. Stock cooperative in Laguna Woods, that could be applicable, right? Not everything in Laguna Woods is a stock cooperative.
One thing to notice, anytime you click those boxes, it automatically adds.
It's adding the form. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you for pointing that out. If you didn't hear Carlos, he said every time I check the box, it's adding the form to my file. A couple of other things as we go through it. Backup offer addendum. If I'm a listing agent, I would never accept a backup offer addendum, and the reason would be simple. the backup offer addendum, it gives control to the next buyer in line. In addition to that, to obligate that buyer who's in backup offer position to force him to move forward, not only would the seller have to deliver cancellation of the contract, but also cancellation of the escrow. Many times when a cancellation occurs, there could be a dispute over the deposit and the escrow may not be canceled. So that would mean the buyer in position one has control over the property and the seller can't do anything. So don't accept a backup offer addendum. If you can get them to accept it, wonderful. You control the property if the initial transaction cancels. And then buyer intent to exchange addendum. That's if it's a 1031 exchange. Now, notification is not a requirement under law. You may do that just to put them on notice. If I'm a buyer and I am going to submit an offer, I am not going to tell the seller that this is predicated upon completion of a 1031 exchange. And why is that? Especially in today's world, I'm a buyer, I have very few options. So the seller is going to look at me and say, hey, I've got a lot of control over this person because they don't have any options. My opinion, right? Because it is not, you can fill it out in a certain manner so it can be a contingency, but why would any seller accept that? And then if in the event the relinquished property is closed escrow already for the buyer, why would you even suggest that? Why would you bring that up? I would just get them to accept it. That's what I would do. Or and you'd have to give evidence that you have the money, but still, nonetheless. So I'm going to just go through a few of these things in the purchase contract that I didn't address. Retention of deposit, we'll get to that in liquidated damages, address that. And then we said all cash offer. It talks about this as being a type of financing. Limits on credits to buyer. So we talked about this, but remember, if there is a credit issued in favor of the buyer and the credit exceeds the allowable amount as defined by the lender, if you haven't specified it, that the balance is a dollar for dollar reduction in the purchase price, the buyer could lose that money. And then verification of down payment closing costs and applications, that seems to be self-explanatory. Buyer stated financing, it's saying sellers relying on buyer's representation of the type of financing specified, including but not limited to, as applicable, all cash. So it even defines all cash as a type of financing. And it specifies that the seller or the buyer shall pursue the financing as denoted in the agreement. But the buyer can elect to pursue an alternative form of financing. Let's see. And then 7B, this is always a question that comes up. Sometimes sellers or people want to say that it's as is. Well, it's already in the contract. So writing it again isn't going to change anything. And it doesn't change the seller's obligation to disclose any deficiencies which they know of in the property, even if the offer or the contract states as is. And even if you write in a contract that all the parties agree to not ask for any repairs, it doesn't stop any buyer from doing that. And it's not a breach of contract. So we hear that often, and then buyers, guess what? Ask for repairs after an accepted contract occurs. Let's see. And then if a seller is going to be remaining in possession of the property after escrow, you should always have a document addressing their occupancy, because there is liability for the buyer. So at minimum, seller in possession form or a residential lease after sale. So I would never allow a transaction to close without having a lease agreement. That's really what it is in place for the duration of the buyer of the seller's occupancy. I don't care if it's 2 days. Let's see. And then the contract is more explicit, section E, in terms of the items that the seller must deliver: keys, lockbox keys. If there is a fee associated to gain access to community property or community association properties like the pools, then maybe the seller may have to pay for that. but it's much more explicit in regards to what the buyer's obligation, excuse me, the seller's obligation in terms of delivery of that information. And then a couple of other things, buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit balance of down payment and closing costs are not contingencies. So remember, if they say they have the money, they can't cancel based on that because they don't have it. Unfortunately, I'm just going to browse over some of this because everyone's getting jaded right about now. And then removal of contingency. This is kind of an important thing. If after the time frame passes in terms of when a buyer must remove contingencies, the contingency period continues on. But remember, the buyer has no obligation to remove contingencies unless the seller delivers all the disclosures. So if they say remove your contingencies, well, you didn't give me your seller disclosures, they can't cancel. And if they do, they would be in breach of contract. And then items included in the sale talks about the fixtures, and there's an area up above. We talked about it. If you're unsure, check the boxes to be sure. Lease or lien items, more specifically, usually it refers to solar panels. And then if your client has, I'm trying to think, a specific type of financing that shows up on the property tax bill, typically, yeah, hero loan, thank you, hero or PACE loan. Typically, a buyer's lender will not allow the buyer to assume that financing. They'll require that to be paid off. I think it's a Fannie Mae requirement, actually. So if it's traditional financing for solar panels, the lender will typically permit the buyer to assume that obligation. But if it's a hero or PACE loan, and the only way you'll see that is on a property tax bill, it is not going to be assumable if the buyer is getting a loan, and that will require the seller to pay that off in full. It's a big surprise because usually it's a lot of money. Let's see, some requirements. I've touched upon a lot of these things as a matter of fact. And withholding taxes, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, remember the buyer has an obligation to obtain from the seller that tax ID. If the seller doesn't have a tax ID, then the seller theoretically could be subject to withholding. And withholding can be 15% of the purchase price is more than $1 million for federal, 3 1/3% for state. Yeah, a lot of money. Common interest disclosures, we talked about that. Natural and environmental hazards, we talked about that. Let's see. Title investing. Let's see, time periods. So the contract changed in terms of delivery of a notice to perform. Before it was 2 days before the expiration of the contingency, and the contingency, let's assume the expiration date of the contingency fell on a Saturday. So theoretically they had till Monday to remove contingencies. So you couldn't deliver a notice to perform in my example until Saturday. Now the contract specifies that at the expiration of the contingency falls on a Saturday, you can deliver it no sooner than 2 days before the actual specified date. And if you deliver it sooner than that, then that delivery of a notice to perform is considered to be defective and has no validity. So delivery of a notice to perform can occur no sooner than 2 days before the expiration of a contingency, or it can occur later. If you deliver it sooner, it's defective and is not valid. So it just gives the buyer more time if you're delivering the notice to perform improperly. We'll go on to cancellations at some other point in time. Demand to close escrow, repairs, let's see. Assignment, we talked about that. It describes in more detail what is deemed to be assignable theoretically without the approval of the seller, although they have to agree to it. And then let's just go through the definitions here so we can wrap this up. The agreement refers to the purchase contract and all addenda. As is condition, it is the property condition. It still states that the seller must disclose all known material facts. Counting days, so remember, we count all days. So if the execution of the contract is today, and the close of escrow is 30 days from today, day one is tomorrow. And if the execution falls on a weekend or legal holiday, then the execution of that event falls to the following business day. That is not applicable to a purchase and offer. It is simply days. So if I write an offer on Thursday and it expires 3 days later, it will expire on Sunday. So it does not fall to the following business day. It's only following execution of the contract, and once the contract is fully completed. And then the only time in which we count simply business days is for the initial deposit. Nothing else in here counts or is based upon business days. All right. And then, did I miss anything there? And yes, I did. Acceptance. So acceptance of a contract is deemed to be delivery. So I submit an offer today. The listing agent has the seller sign tomorrow. If they deliver the contract back to me signed tomorrow, that is the date of acceptance. If they delivered a week from tomorrow, the date of acceptance is the date of delivery back to the buyer. And that's important when counting contingency days, when looking at the close of escrow. So the contract has a field in which you should be specifying the date of acceptance because it may not be the date of the last signature. Let's say, a couple of questions. Okay, I think I got this. So a trust sale, the buyer or buyer's agent is supposed to complete all their due diligence before moving contingencies. The seller never lived in the property, is just the trustee. So I think sometimes there's confusion in regards to whether or not somebody falls subject to transfer disclosures law. If it's an investor, they never lived in the property, they still have an obligation to complete a TDS. So they're subject to it. Exemptions to the TDS law would include, I'm the successor trustee, my parents died, I never lived in the property. So that's an exemption to providing a TDS. So certain disclosures I'm not required to provide.
Even if your parents shared something with you.
Correct. If I didn't live in the property during the year prior to the date of execution of the contract. Right. But if I bought that property, I transferred into my family trust and I want to sell it, just because it's in a trust doesn't mean it's exempt from providing a TDS. It's an LLC, corporation, they're all subject providing a TDS. So, you know, sometimes we see some odd things with relocation companies. They'll transfer title from the seller, and then the reload company still has an obligation to provide those disclosures. And so typically what they'll do, they'll say we never occupied the property. Then we'll attach to that the former owner's disclosures, because that owner has to provide the reload company with all those disclosures. It's awkward, actually, but the very few people that are not subject to providing a transfer disclosure statement. And remember, the contract specifies if you're obligated to provide a TDS, you're also obligated to provide a seller property questionnaire. If you're exempt from providing a TDS, then you must provide an exempt seller disclosure. And John Barris has a request for a photographer in Los Angeles. And then did I answer, Quang, did I answer your question, I hope?
Thank you so much, Richard. Yeah,
Okay,
I really
all right, good.
appreciate that. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Almost done. We talked about liquidated damages. Remember, if it's not an investment property, the maximum amount someone that the buyer is subjected to is 3% of the purchase price. So 3% of the purchase price or the initial good faith deposit. Otherwise, there's no 3% limitation. And remember, the liquidated damages clause does not apply to the seller. It's only in the event of a breach by the buyer. Seller breaches, then it's whatever the damages are. Contract is always subject to mediation. If there's any type of disagreement, parties agree to mediate. Arbitration is not mandatory. The parties would have to initial all of the areas here for arbitration to apply. Same thing with liquidated damages. If all parties to the contract do not initial these two paragraphs, specifically 29 and 31, then they'll be excluded from the contract, and you are required to complete the contract by issuing a counteroffer, because the contract's not deemed to be complete until that's addressed. And then we talked about the expiration of the offer already, and then entity of buyers. A lot of times we'll have someone who's submitting an offer on behalf of an entity, LLC, trust, whatever the case may be. Do they have to submit a representative capacity signature disclosure with the initial offer? No, but they should sign it as Richard Moore trustee, or as Richard Moore president of the company, or Richard Moore managing member. As long as they sign in that capacity, it's acceptable. It's simplistic when we use the RCSD, because I can say that on that form that I am the president of the corporation, and anytime I sign in my name as Richard Moore, it's deemed to be in the capacity as president of the corporation. So I think we've addressed some of the most important things. One other thing, if in the event we want to know if somebody did present our offer, we can see request that the agent who's representing the seller initial this and return it. Okay. We want evidence because we don't believe it, and a lot of agents don't believe it now. Yeah. And then I think there's a rejection of the offer in here also too somewhere.
There
John,
is.
you should know. Where is it, John?
Yes, I've used that several times. I believe it's page 16 at the bottom or 15 at the bottom.
There it is,
Right
offer
there.
not accepted. So yeah, at the very bottom of the page, offer not accepted. So if we don't believe that the agent presented the offer, ask them to have the seller initial these clauses and return to you.
I have a quick question.
That call or email. Yeah. Yes, John.
Where is it? And because I did not see it on the offers, I was looking at this last couple of days. Where is the agent's email address?
Well, that's a good question, John.
I don't think it prints on.
All right, here.
I
If
can
we look
see
at-
that, but they have to put that in the designated electronic address. I had one person out of all the offers I got that had it in there, and it was the wrong email address.
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up, because I use the cover sheet and I put the email address in for the agent, but it is not populating that here. Huh.
Exactly.
Good. See, I learned something new today.
The old RPA that had our signature line always had it in there with
Yeah.
all of our address and all that information.
Yeah, it did. What a pain in the ass, huh? Now we have one more field to complete.
Maybe it's assumed that whatever email address you're sending it from is the email that you're going to reply to.
It could be, but that before it did, at least it had the contact information in there.
And there's nothing in that drop down.
No, I'm clicking on it and it's not. I wonder.
That does is if you typed in the email addresses before, it'll show you the previous email address you typed in.
Just wondering the cover sheet. The cover sheet was not amended to the best of my knowledge.
Cover sheet has the email address on it. However, it doesn't translate here.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's not pulling from the field there. So I guess Carlos is right. If you don't put it in, it's presumed to be the address from which it originated, but it certainly is helpful to have all that information in there. It certainly is helpful for escrow to have all that. They see the purchase contract. So they have some of the contact information for the people already involved in the transaction. Well, glad you brought that up, John. Thank you.
I guess we'll have to do a new RPA again.
I think you should submit that to the forms committee. That's a good suggestion, John.
Yeah, where's Tony? Let's
Where's
contact him.
Tony? That's right. Where's Tony? Want me to him? All right. Well, that's all I have for the day. Any other questions? I'd say there are no other questions. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, today. It's good to see your faces.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Ron. Thank you.
Now go sit my offer in.
Send your.